My name is Dario Hasenstab. I have a degree in international affairs, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, a former university professor of mine, as well as an IR consultant. And together, we're bursting the Western bubble. If you would like to know more about how this podcast started, what the Western bubble is, or who we are, make sure to listen to our introduction episode. This being said, let's get to it. Because every fifth episode of this podcast, and this being episode number 10, we will go through the news of the past month and relate to our analysis of our past recordings. If you, as our listeners, encounter any articles relevant to our content, we would be grateful for you to share them with us. This week's episode will specifically talk about how domestic issues in the United States relate to larger Western problems, the continued problem the West has in properly analyzing the Russia-Ukraine war, and finally, Chinese geopolitical plays. And the first episode from our past recordings we want to discuss today is episode 3, the hollowing out of institutions, where in the episode we analyzed how the hollowing out of institutions and how this basically influences external Western actions, where societies, especially Western societies, have become so tribal that it is no longer about strengthening the Western system, but rather focused on your own tribe winning the fight against the other side. We looked at the US Supreme Court decision on Roe against Wade and Boris Johnson clinging onto power as UK Prime Minister. And the way that we started talking about this episode, or how both of us were reminded of this, is when just prior to recording, basically 10 minutes ago, both of us we had a discussion about US President Joe Biden forgiving student debt in the United States. How does this relate to the hollowing out of institutions episode?
Well, there are a lot of interesting conversations to be had about the whole situation in the United States when it comes to debt relief. You mentioned, Dario, before recording, fairness principles and the problems with the way this is being implemented, the people who are being targeted, the political side of it, and all of those are very fair points. However, if you take a step back, the bigger question is, how is it possible that a country that has had such a successful past 100 years, and we talked about this in the other episode, on episode 6 and 7, if I recall correctly, on the United States, that has been so successful in developing its economy, developing its intellectual base, that we're now in a situation that in order for you to get some proper education, you actually get indebted, right? So beyond the question of whether Biden's plan is actually the right plan or not, and you argue that there are lots of problems with it, and I would wholeheartedly agree. From an IR perspective, the very observation that we look at the United States, the richest country in the world, and we see a whole generation being burdened by crippling debt, something went horribly wrong in that society, right? And we've discussed the importance of, if the West wants to be a model for the rest of the world to follow, they have to start at home first. And no country looks at the United States and says, that is a method that we want to copy, where we have to make people borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to get some proper education. That is something going horribly wrong. And not just in one specific policy area, but slowly over time, step by step, from an evolutionary perspective, sliding down a hill.
Exactly. So it relates back to the theme that we mentioned, as you just pointed to in episode 6 and 7, the rise and fall of US foreign policy, where when it came to the rise of US foreign policy, the United States became this beacon of development and this example for everyone else in the world. And then during the fall, we're now looking at the United States as a country that no longer seems to serve as an example. And I think that apart from the from the discussion whether we agree with the relief of this debt or not, it's right. I mean, I never had the feeling, oh, I would like to study in the United States. I mean, firstly because way too expensive. I mean, yes, maybe you would receive the top education in the world, but at a price that I'm not sure in what time period I would be able to repay.
And that's a huge difference, simply from a intuitive sense. from perspective, just from a emotional connection perspective, a huge difference with respect to a generation ago, right? And we mentioned this in that podcast episode as well on the United States, that when I was a student, everyone wanted to go to the United States. So that has switched around very quickly. And that is not one or two policy initiatives that have gone wrong. It's not George W. Bush or Barack Obama or Donald Trump doing one or two things, making all of a sudden the United States becoming less attractive. It is a path of many decades that 25 years ago maybe wasn't as visible yet, but very much was there, and now has become completely visible, of a society that is no longer able to manage its own internal affairs properly. And if that is the case, how can you ever pretend to be an example for the rest of the world?
And this example of student debt, I mean, it's just a symptom of what we have discussed. Is one of the main problems with the hollowing out of institutions. Is the struggling middle class in general. Is that the foundation for a strong, prosperous Western society is a strong middle class, and that the current middle class is further eroding by having to indebt itself in order to just, I would say, or I would even argue, just to maintain its current economic status. You have to indebt yourself to go to university, to find a proper job, to continue to be part of the middle class.
Exactly, and it is a matter of not realizing how society is decaying, right? It is not being able to look in the mirror as the United States. And by the way, when we say the United States, in many ways, we're also talking about Europe. The United States is a more an extreme example, but Europe tends to follow the US in these kinds of historical patterns quite a bit, with a bit of a delay. It is, for example, in the case of the United States, saying 100 years ago, our success is based on not oppressing people through government. We're going to celebrate the individual, and we have this elegant capitalist market system to make that happen. And then confusing that idea over time with just pure market adoration, pure worshipping of the market, and no longer even recognizing the need to have some kind of basic government structure in place to protect that middle class, right? That is something that over time then it's accelerated in the 1980s under Reagan, but over time the United States has forgotten that, yes, it is a country that has rejected European government oppression because of its past history, because of its experiences of religious oppression in Europe, and the ever continuing class system in Europe, and the United States saying we want to do things differently. That's why it was in many ways created. Confusing that principle with an extreme version of it. And that extreme version has meant that over time, the United States has completely given up on taking the government seriously, taking the very core principles, the very core institutions that are at the heart of any society seriously, not investing in those. And now you see a political environment that is crumbling, and you see a middle class that no longer has the support mechanism necessary. The only ones that are benefiting in the short term from this are those with the economic power to actually protect themselves, right? The top 10%.
See, and one of my main concerns and arguments against the policy proposal by Biden was more or less this, just that I count the middle class basically to the already prosperous part in society, and that this money would be spent better on the half of society or half of the country that has not gone to university and has not gone to college. And with this, I want to transition into another problem, domestic problem the United States is failing, into maybe the thousands and thousands of people who are homeless in the United States. And here, because both of us like to compare our YouTube algorithms, because it is almost a representation of who we are, given that machines maybe at some point know us better than we know ourselves. And something that has come up quite a lot in my personal YouTube algorithm lately is our videos about homeless people in San Francisco. And I don't know whether it's just a very extreme and one-sided way of reporting about this. And I mean, I've only clicked on one or two of these videos, but it seems like homelessness is becoming an increasing issue in the United States, and one that's maybe not being taken care of as well as it should be.
This is statistically completely evident. It's also anecdotally completely obvious for anyone who travels to the United States. And San Francisco, by the way, is a very clear example of that. When you walk through San Francisco now, there are way more visible homeless people than 20 years ago, but it's a broader thing, and this is statistically clear. There is a poor class in the United States, but there also is an extremely poor class in the United States, and that both of those groups are growing. And the top rich, the top 10% is now becoming the top 15%, so that is growing, and that means that percentage-wise, the people in the middle, the backbone of society, are disappearing, right? And that's why the United States has much bigger problems than simply dealing with a specific poverty challenge or anything like that. It goes to the very heart of what the United States wants to be. If it wants to be this thriving, prosperous nation, then it's not just about helping poor people. It is about having the backbone, the middle class, strong again, right? Going back to the poverty issue, it is directly the result of a government that is not functioning anymore in the United States. There is no government mechanism that helps poor people in any way that can be compared to European countries anymore, or that could be compared to the United States 40, 50, 60 years ago. The government is failing at that level in the United States because of these patterns that we have discussed. Without a properly functioning government apparatus, and you don't have to be a raving communist, to argue this, you cannot actually fulfill the basic moral duties that you as a society have. And surely avoiding homelessness is one of the core principles of any reasonable society, right? Nobody can look around and say homelessness is everywhere, but we are a moral, righteous society. And without some kind of government apparatus, it's just not going to happen. You're not going to be able to deal with the homelessness issues. Why is there no government apparatus? Because of the lack of confidence in the government, because of a middle class that is no longer able to defend its interests through the government and is squeezing out of society.
See, and not only do we observe a failing part of the government, but also an active process of undermining the US government. And here I'm obviously transitioning to the next domestic issue we want to discuss, and something that was very big in the news about 2 weeks ago. It was when the FBI raided former president, US President Donald Trump's residency in Florida. I don't think we should get into the specifics of why this happened. We're not a podcast about US domestic issues, but it is another example of how institutions are undermined, of how there's a politicized process in an area of the government that shouldn't be politicized.
Yeah, so this goes both ways. In many ways, Democrats and those critical of Trump have focused too much on the individual of Donald Trump, and the result of that is that Donald Trump has become the symbol for a large group of Americans who stands up against sort of the liberal establishment. And I think it's been a mistake to continuously go on and on about Donald Trump and how crazy he is and how horrible he is. TV shows. I mean, I used to love The Daily Show. I used to love all those Stephen Colbert and people like that. I loved watching them, but they became completely obsessed with Donald Trump, and the result of that is that Donald Trump is becoming much bigger than he should be. In a well-functioning society, what happened here, what should have happened was this: Donald Trump, a not very good president, did something probably quite dodgy, something he shouldn't have done. He took secret documents home with him for whatever reasons, we don't know, it doesn't really matter. The FBI investigates that, FBI takes some of those documents back with them. There will be a process. Maybe there will be a court case. Case closed. And if Donald Trump is found guilty, then he will face some punishment. If he's not found guilty, not. That is the simple process that you want. Instead, the moment that the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago, you straight away get this political fight about whether the FBI is somehow biased and on the side of the Democrats, anti-Trump. And that is terrible, terrible news for a well-functioning democracy. Because a well-functioning democracy needs to understand that its institutions are neutral, that the FBI, the police, legal institutions are not on the side of any political party, and yet everything has become politicized. So rather than letting the FBI do its thing, it has now become a fight between Republicans and Democrats. And that's once again a sign of how poorly Western societies are doing at the moment.
And this is exactly what I read out earlier when I summarized the episode on hollowing out of institutions, that it's no longer about strengthening the system, but rather on focusing on your tribe winning the fight.
But that is not just on behalf of the Republican Party that we should be critical here. It's the Democrats as well who make these kinds of mistakes and who politicize all kinds of things that they shouldn't be politicizing. There should be some red lines that you don't cross, and yet they're being crossed.
And moving on to another red line is that, and this one flew past me in the news, but you mentioned it in our discussion before this episode, is that now the Supreme Court is basically being questioned, where people are raising the thought that there should be term limits introduced to the judges, right?
And that's exactly the same pattern once again. And it's good now that after being critical of sort of the right side of American society, we can also be critical of the left side of American society. So we discussed Roe v. Wade in our podcast before. And the overturning and how bad that was as a step of the Supreme Court to not understand that beyond any specific choices it makes, it also needs to understand its own position, and that its own position should be beyond a reproach, right? Its own position is one of wise seat of judicial power that is neutral in every aspect and is there to protect American society. And Americans should be able to look at it like that. The fact that they made the choice to overturn Roe v. Wade, even if there might have been proper legal arguments in favor of it, was something that completely undermined the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the eyes of 60% of the population or something like that. Because it's such a hot, controversial topic and the Supreme Court should not have touched it. Okay, now, a few weeks later, we see exactly the problem with what happened. Because now, the left side of American society, the liberals, are incredibly angry and bitter about this choice, and they want to get rid of the people who made this choice. And as a result, there is a serious attempt to introduce, it's not going to make it, I suspect, but a serious attempt to introduce term limits to Supreme Court justices. Now, the result of that, of course, would be a further politicization of the Supreme Court. The moment you know that a justice is no longer going to be there for the rest of their lives, that means that there is this continuous political process around the successor, around the next person who needs to take that seat. And it's no longer about someone who should be there on the merits of their legal expertise and their internal wisdom, but it's all about which party at which time is the biggest so that they can appoint their own justices. It completely undermines this whole fundamental principle of institutional neutrality. And you can see this kind of thing in other institutions as well, right? One of the things that's very frustrating for outsiders who don't understand academia very well to see about universities is tenure, right? Tenured professors. By the way, I'm not tenured. I'm an associate at our university, so it's not because I've got a day job. I've got some real work to do. But tenured professors can be very frustrating for society to watch, because that means that a professor, well, you have to take it very, very far for the university to even be able to consider firing you. Right? You would have to murder three students in broad daylight before the university has a talk with you, like, oh, we don't know if we should continue at our great institution. The reason for tenure, though, is to keep that independence of the professor, to make sure that the professor can freely and openly analyze and research the things they want to analyze. And that's exactly what you should have with Supreme Court justices as well. Keep in mind that if a Supreme Court justice is 50 years old and he knows that 10 years from now his term limit is up, then he will start thinking, okay, what do I do next? What do I do for the next 10 years of my career before I retire? And then they will start talking to the political parties that might support them. And they start engaging in this whole back and forth that they shouldn't be engaging in. They should be above society. Instead, we're dragging them into the political fight.
And this is relevant for us because of the position the West has globally.
Exactly. The West has to be this example towards the rest of the world if it believes in its own role in destiny, right? If it believes in the end of history still somehow, that the democratic liberal model is the way to go. Unfortunately, they seem to forget about their internal weaknesses and very much focus on the foreign policy global game, where they are no longer really concerned about who they are domestically, but they are basically pushing an agenda, a self-serving agenda elsewhere. And a very clear example of that, of course, is Ukraine, which was going to be the next topic of our conversation, where you can see the trouble it has in actually looking at the conflict of Ukraine and Russia in a analytical, neutral, productive way, and rather it chooses to take sides and focuses on its tribal sphere.
Exactly. What a nice transition. Yeah, towards the next episode we want to discuss. This is the very first. I mean, it's the first episode, but it's not the very first episode we recorded. That was the introduction episode, and here we spoke about. So in episode one, we spoke about Russia and Ukraine, where we basically discussed Ukraine and analyzed the West's attitudes and involvement regarding the war in Ukraine. We discussed specifically the differences in Western perception of Putin versus Zelensky, and most importantly, the damage that embracing one and demonizing the other can cause. The reason why, I mean, at least the article that kind of sparked my interest on this very topic last week, I think it was published on Euronews. But the title just said, "Did we grow tired of the Ukraine war on TV and in newspapers?" I mean, to me, the Ukraine war became very repetitive after 3 weeks, when it was really just about looking, oh, here, there, they took a town, they retook a town, and so on.
Yeah, analytically, there wasn't much interesting to observe anymore, right? From an analysis perspective, not from a moral perspective, because every day people are dying, homes are being destroyed, human suffering takes place. But that is not particularly challenging from an intellectual perspective. What should be our interest at this stage of the war is how do we bring it to an end, right? And that kind of analysis is completely lacking. No one is writing about what kind of success, or at least mitigated failure, limited failure, are we looking at in order to bring the violence to a close. And the reason for that is that would involve us stepping out of our little bubble, Western bubble, and saying, okay, the conflict in Ukraine will finish in a way that is not satisfactory to either party.
And how much of this bubble is us constantly reading about this in the media? Because I mean, again, it's all day long. You read the evil Russia bombed a school there, a hospital there. This and this many people died here. I mean, I mean, the media has already made up its mind of who's the bad guy here. So is this influencing our thinking in how can we bring this to an end?
Yeah, because if you have created this picture in your mind of good versus evil, which we clearly did, and we did that straight away. We did that already before the war started, by the way, with the help of people like Biden as well, who already pushed for this image, like we are gonna stand together, united against an evil Putin. Then the analysis kind of stops, and it just becomes a matter of defeating the enemy, defeating the bad guys, and the media is clearly in this tunnel still, very much so. But they're noticing that people are switching off. Now, you mentioned this before. Part of it is that intellectually there is not much interesting going on. It's a military exercise right now. It's about who's winning, and in the end, spoiler alerts, no one is going to win this war completely. There's not going to be a brilliant Ukrainian victory, and there's not going to be any brilliant Russian victory either. At the end, it's going to have to stop with both parties compromising in a certain way. But the fact that our generation, our media, is not capable of analyzing it properly and just playing this simplistic bubble game is an indication of our times. You're also the generation before me. You've got a bit of a, your generation, not you specifically, Dario. I would never say that about you, but your generation has a bit of an attention deficit disorder, right? It's your generation finds it very difficult to simply take a book and sit under a tree and read for a few hours without looking at their phones. And the result of that is that the media, in order to keep this war alive, needs to sort of talk about human interest stories, about victims, but they cannot actually do the proper in-depth thinking that is required, because consumers of media are just not interested in that anymore. They're moving on. They after a few weeks, after a few months, they're looking for the next big story. And this is a very common pattern in general with respect to foreign policy, but it's getting worse and worse, right? So foreign policy is typically one of those things that people are very excited about for a short period of time. Any war, any kind of economic struggle that happens globally is interesting for a short period of time. But after a while, when the people don't see the direct consequences in their daily lives, they move on from there.
An example of this the first that comes to my mind is the war in Syria. And here you would think that attention would be on there a little bit longer because people felt the effect through the refugee movements afterwards, but very quickly became about the refugees here and no longer about the problem in Syria. Then the war in Afghanistan is an example. You said that now we focus more and more on individual stories that happen within the Ukraine war. And an example of one of these individual stories was the murder of Daria Dugina, the daughter of a Russian nationalist who died in a car explosion. So how is this an example of individual stories being put on the cover and this distracting from a conversation, from a bigger picture conversation? How could this be solved?
Well, in general, with these kinds of topics, is that you want people to be able to emotionally relate to the news. And how do you relate to the news emotionally? By humanizing it, right? By giving it a human face. This specific example, though, is very interesting for different reasons, because this was the attempted murder of Alexander Dugin, who is a ultra-nationalist, as you said. In the end, at least as far as we think what happened is that he was the target, and she got in his car and she got murdered instead, but she wasn't the actual target. And what you notice here in the media, Western media bubble, is that they didn't know how to actually cover it, because it's a really interesting story for them to cover in itself, but it is one in which possibly Ukrainian intelligence agencies are involved. That's at least what Russia claims. Russian officials have claimed that. We don't know if that's the case, but it is clear that this is about a Russian person being the victim of violence very likely related to Ukraine. And that is something that Western media finds very difficult to cover, because do you make them into this human victim, which they should, because she, regardless of what kind of person she was, And regardless of the personality of her father, she is the victim of a brutal assassination, brutal murder. Do you cover it as such, or do you cover it more from a perspective of, oh, who did it, who is behind it, uh, what is the political philosophy of her father? What is her political philosophy? And that is what the Western media try to do, right? Rather than giving it the personal attention that it would usually give it. For example, if the daughter of a Ukrainian politician had been killed in a car explosion, then it would have been a completely different story. Straight away, the narrative would have been young woman died in her prime uh, as a result of Russian aggression. But now, the Western media can't do that because it doesn't fit into their narrative, so they have to find a different angle, and they really struggled with it. And you had these real debates. Some articles argued that her father, Alexander Dugin was actually very critical of Putin, and so thereby, through implication, suggesting that it was the Russian government that actually assassinated her and wanted to kill him. Others were saying, "Well, no, it's obvious that she's part of Putin's inner circle, and he's part of Putin's inner circle. But we don't really know if this is a politically motivated act internally within Moscow, or whether it actually is done by outsiders, i.e., Ukrainians." So they were very, very confused about how to report this, and that is once again a really good example of how we in the West believe we're all rational, but in fact we're completely biased in our own little world in which we can only see things through a very Western lens.
Because the opposite example of this happened a few years ago. But yeah, so in Salisbury, when the Sergei and Yulia Skripal, two Russian nationals, were murdered on British grounds through the poison of Novichok. I remember the huge reaction and immediate evil portrayal. I mean, of course, in itself, it's a wrong action to poison people, but that huge, blown out of proportion reaction by the media to this happily portraying Russia as the bad guys.
Yeah, this is something that was very nicely feeding into the existing narrative. It really helps us if the people that we label as bad guys actually do bad things. That makes our lives really, really easy. And it is comforting to know that we were right. That so if you're an anti-Trump person, and you see Trump being a complete idiot, then that is very comforting to you, because it reassures you that your analysis at the beginning was correct. If you see Vladimir Putin doing something evil, that is wonderful for you, because that allows you to actually find comfort in knowing who is right and who is wrong in the world. But if you see Zelensky or Ukrainians or some other person that you've labeled as good do something evil, or something that we reject morally, then we've got a real problem. And then our psyche doesn't like that. We have a very confused reaction typically. So the case of Salisbury was very clearly one of it being a source of confirmation about our worldview. The case of Dugina was one that confuses our worldview. And we're desperately hoping that somehow it turns out that Putin was the one behind the car explosion, the car bomb. Because if it turns out to be Ukrainian intelligence agencies, then that ruins our simplistic picture of good versus evil, the white hats versus the black hats.
And someone who's very much, I want to say, fallen victim to this way of thinking. Originally used to be Boris Johnson, who very much thrived on the Russian invasion of Ukraine because he could portray himself as this wartime prime minister, but his soon to be most likely replacement, Liz Truss, seems to go into similar directions, right? Who's very much embracing this narrative on Russia.
Or possibly even worse, she doesn't seem to have any filter in her brain about the superiority of the Western model. And she even had to when Ukraine when the war started, when Russia invaded Ukraine at the beginning, she as foreign secretary actually put out a statement saying that she and the government would very much encourage British people to take up arms, fly to Ukraine, and start fighting Russians. And even for Boris Johnson, that was a step too far, and he had to pull her back. And they had to have a press release stating that the words by Liz Truss had been taken out of context and badly understood, and blah 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 blah. Liz Truss is a die-hard hawk when it comes to foreign policy with respect to the West versus the rest, and specifically with respect to Ukraine. And that is a real problem. As we said before, if you're looking, and everyone should be doing this, if you're looking to find a way to end the violence in Ukraine, to end the bloodshed, to end the suffering of people, then you cannot be on a moral high horse. You cannot go and say, we will not stop until Russia has been defeated and Crimea is Ukrainian again. Because, newsflash, that's never going to happen. And that is not the way to bring peace or stability to these two countries. Liz Truss is more hawkish than Zelensky, and that is bad news for foreign policy if you're British or if you're European. Now, one thing that Liz Truss also has is this sincere apparent belief in good versus evil, sort of a simplistic mind, if I might say so, of saying we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And this has been more and more pronounced in foreign policy overall, right? Liz Truss is a extreme example of this, but the neoconservatives, the ones that we've mentioned before when we talked about the United States, made this gigantic error as well. They went into the war in Iraq in 2003 and afterward, and then the global war on terror, believing that they were obviously the good guys. And I said before, white hats versus black hats. That's not a coincidence, because that's the old westerns, the American westerns, where the good guy would always be wearing a white hat and the bad guy would always be wearing a black hat. And who was a great fan of those kinds of films? Leo Strauss, the father of neoconservatism. And so it's that movement that has sort of introduced the acceptance that the West somehow is validated in everything that they do because they are the good guys. And someone like Liz Truss doesn't have the intellectual capacity to really fully comprehend what she's doing, but she's the product of that process over many decades.
Exactly, and these dynamics we discussed at great length in our episode number 7 when we discussed the fall of US foreign policy. So speaking of good versus evil, another evil that Russia has been doing lately, and this is kind of the news item we want to feature here, is that there are now exercises being held between Russia and some other countries. And these other countries include China, India, Laos, Mongolia, Nicaragua, Algeria, Syria, and a number of former Soviet states, is what the article said, which I just think is very interesting, that it's these countries and a number of former Soviet states. So basically we want to obviously highlight the fact that Russia is conducting a military exercise together with China, kind of relating that to the Ukraine episode, that the world tried to isolate Russia. Well, no, the Western world tried to isolate Russia, but it did not work out that well. And we also want to relate this to one of our more recent episodes, episode 8, when we talked about China and Taiwan, where we analyzed the Western reaction towards the China-Taiwan conflict, simply because Taiwan in the West is seen as a symbol of the world wanting to copy the Western model of liberal democracy, and that the West somehow needs to defend this. So before we move on to maybe some of the other countries involved, I mean, so what message is this sending to the world, that the West tried to isolate Russia, but it didn't work out?
Well, this is a negative, bad result from Western foreign policy that goes well beyond Ukraine, right? It's been going on for a very long time, with the West in the 21st century on this moral high horse and rejecting Russia and rejecting China for not following the liberal democratic game. It seems obvious that they're pushing these countries towards each other. And the fact that China and Russia are holding military operations, even without the war in Ukraine, would have been a likely scenario. That in itself is not surprising, and that is simply the result of the West saying, you are on the wrong side of history, and then China and Russia looking at each other and saying, okay, well, if that's what the West thinks, we will show them differently. The fact that China hasn't taken a particularly critical stance against Russian action in Ukraine is very telling about how China views geopolitics at the moment. Because China is paying a price for this. China is paying a price for not speaking out. It is if China wants to provide this model of prosperity towards the rest of the world, then they cannot afford to be seen liaising, allying with someone like Vladimir Putin, who generally globally is considered too much of a warmonger. But they do this because geopolitically, strategically, it makes sense from a Chinese perspective, and it made sense before the invasion of Ukraine as well. What is more interesting strategically here is the inclusion of India. Because keep in mind that even though India has a history of relatively good close relations with Russia, this goes back all the way to the non-alignment of the Cold War, where India didn't take sides between the United States and the Soviet Union, India does have China as a natural rival. You would think that China and India do not want to engage in military exercises together because they are two huge countries, both with a population of about 1.4 billion people, who are eyeing each other and geographically and naturally seem bound to clash with each other in some way. And yet, India is not taking that stance anymore. India is not playing a hard game against China and is letting Russia create a triangle of power between New Delhi, Beijing, and Moscow. And that is really, really bad news for the West.
I mean, it just, I'm going to read this list out again. If you just look at the countries that India is basically now aligning themselves with, you wouldn't think that those are the traditional allies, right? So we're talking about China, okay, but then Laos, Mongolia, Nicaragua, Algeria, Syria, and a number of former Soviet states, not to forget those. This does not fit into this image that at least I have always perceived in Western conversations, where it's all about, India, the biggest democracy in the world. And that makes it a natural ally, I assume. India wants to be like the West. India is following that Western model of development. I'm not getting a lot of that through this military exercise.
And this is absolutely fascinating, again, when it comes to Western psychology. So, given that India is a democracy, its democratic credentials are a little bit under threat under the Modi government, to be fair, but India can proudly say that they are the largest democracy in the world. The West has been completely ignoring any threat coming out of India, any problems coming out of India. It has the label democracy, and the West has this blind spot when it comes to India. It's not just that they let India get away with all kinds of things simply because it has the label democracy, but also they do not have any strategy towards India. They don't care really about what India does. It sort of feels like a safe place. Sometimes they make some mistakes, whatever, we don't care. We worry about China and Russia, which is of course fascinating from a neutral, rational perspective. That if you're strategically concerned about the world order in the 21st century, India should be one of your main concerns. Because India is not yet dedicated to either side of the geopolitical spectrum. So if you want to create a world in your own image, then India should be a main focal point of your strategy. And yet the West completely ignores India because you know what, they're a democracy, they're going to be like us, they're going to be with us forever. And reality is showing that that's not the case. That first of all, India is questioning at the moment its own democratic values and because of its current government. And secondly, India strategically is looking at the world and saying, are North America and Europe really that useful to us? Or is Russia and China the future for us? And do we need to sort of create some bridges with China and stop this border bickering between our two nations and see if we can work together, because Asia is the new core, the new center of world affairs. That's what India is doing, and the West seems to be completely blind to this.
Is China going to be successful with this? I mean, will there be a world where the majority of the countries and the majority of the economic power is following the Chinese model or China?
Well, that's very questionable still, right? It seems much more likely that we're moving towards a world, sort of a genuine multipolar world with various groups that vaguely align with each other. The idea of China leading a coalition of Russia and India seems very far off, right? Russia is sometimes now being called a puppet of China because of Putin's dependence, economic and strategic dependence on Xi Jinping, but that's an exaggeration. India will never be in any way accept being somehow a puppet of China. And China will not accept much less from India when it comes to a close alliance. So those two will not bond together to form a big anti-Western bloc. That seems obvious. The question is more whether the West will be able to use India for its own agenda, and that is more questionable, right? That's unlikely. It is not that obvious what the path is for the West in the 21st century, let's say moving towards 2050, what the West is to actually stabilize global affairs and promote its liberal democratic values. But whatever that path is, it should include India, and it seems obvious that India is not very keen on playing that game. So in that sense, China will have a victory there, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have a world where everything is centered around Beijing and Russia and India will happily follow Xi Jinping towards a better tomorrow.
Well, then this seems like a great moment to end today's conversation, basically recapping the previous episodes and what happened last month and how we can relate that to each other. If you have any questions, comments, or regards, make sure to send us an email to jhasenstab@reichgroup.org, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you bring for us today?
I chose a quote that is interesting because it very much goes to the heart of our podcast series. There are biases in our world. This is not a quote, this is me talking still. There are biases in our worlds that we kind of know about with respect to ourselves, right? When we know ourselves that we have a left-wing bias or right-wing bias. Maybe we don't call it bias, but perspective, whatever. But we're kind of aware of it. But the Western bubble that we're analyzing is actually much deeper than that. It's something that is not something that people walking down the streets of Berlin or New York actually ever think about. The bubble of living in a liberal democracy. And for that, I chose a quote by the great late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. Unconscious bias is one of the hardest things to get at.